The first time she saw it, she didn't understand. A shadow flickered behind his eyes, something ancient, something that belonged to no human code. You think you know the people closest to you. But what if the person you love carries a darkness that no amount of love can touch? That's where this story begins, in a quiet house, a quiet night, with a scream waiting to be born. He had been ordinary, charming even, until the moments of silence grew too long, and the whispers of something else began to seep through. At first, it was subtle, a glance, a word that felt wrong, a hesitation too precise. But shadows are patient. They grow, and they lie in wait, waiting for the perfect moment to awaken. She tried to reach him. She tried to pierce the veil of what was happening inside him. She tried to anchor him to reality, to morality, to humanity itself. But there are some forces that do not answer to pleas. There are monsters that are not born. They are unearthed, dug out from the marrow of someone's soul by a hidden hand, by circumstances, by secrets that were never meant to surface. And once they wake, once they take their first conscious breath, you are no longer dealing with a man. You are dealing with something older, something patient, and infinitely cruel. She thought she could save him. That thought, that simple hope, would cost her more than she ever imagined. And yet, right now, as you sit there, watching this, you have to ask yourself, how much of the world around you is what it seems? How much darkness is waiting in silence for its moment to rise? Because just like her, we all stand on the edge of awakening, and some awakenings cannot be undone. The first signs were almost invisible. A flicker of violence in a casual gesture, a cruelty disguised as a joke. People around him laughed, they excused it, they ignored the warnings. But she saw the patterns, the meticulous way he controlled the room, the subtle ways he bent reality to his will without anyone noticing. This wasn't mere anger. This was architecture. He was constructing something, inside himself and outside, an invisible labyrinth designed to trap her, to trap anyone who dared to look too closely. You might think monsters roar. Some do. But the most dangerous ones whisper. They operate behind the curtain of normality, cloaked in charm, in intellect, in the exact patterns society teaches you to trust. And when you think you've understood them, they shift. A mask falls here, a shadow deepens there, until the person you thought you knew is gone. And in their place stands an intelligence that does not play by human rules. She tried to map it, to anticipate it, to find the cracks that could let her back in. But the deeper she looked, the more she realized, this monster inside him was patient. It had been waiting, sharpening its claws for the precise moment when restraint would fail. And the cruelest truth, you cannot reason with what does not fear consequence. You cannot bargain with what does not value life the way you do. All the love in the world cannot anchor a soul already claimed by something darker, older, and unstoppable. And as she reached out, as she pleaded, she began to understand. Survival is not always about escaping the external threat. Sometimes, it's about facing the horror that has grown quietly in the person you thought was your protector, your partner, your other half. The real question, one you must confront in the mirror of your own life, is this: what if the monster is already inside someone you love? And what if you are powerless to stop its awakening? It started with small acts, almost imperceptible. A misplaced item, a word that cut too deep, a glance that froze the room. She thought she was imagining it, but every instinct screamed otherwise. This was no ordinary darkness. This was deliberate. The kind of darkness that studies you, learns you, and waits for the exact moment your defenses are lowest. And that's when the pattern became clear. This monster inside him wasn't random. It had a logic. It had a method. Some call it psychopathy. Others call it demonic possession. But the truth is more disturbing. It is human, yet beyond humanity. It is born from the shadows of society, from the cracks in morality, from secrets that the world refuses to see. Institutions, families, governments, they all play a part. They teach restraint, obedience, civility, but they never teach how to confront a mind that does not obey. And when someone like him awakens, those systems, those invisible control mechanisms, fail. Completely. Because the rules no longer apply. She realized, slowly, painfully, that she was not fighting him. She was fighting every hidden hand that shaped him, every unseen force that nurtured his darkness, every silent permission society had granted monsters for centuries. And as that realization sank in, fear turned into something sharper, something colder. She understood that the only way to survive, the only way to resist the inevitable, was to confront truths that most men run from all their lives. Truths about power, about control, about what it truly means to dominate or be dominated. And you, sitting there, need to ask yourself, how many monsters walk among us, cloaked in normality, nurtured by the world's indifference, waiting for a spark to awaken? The answer is terrifying because the spark can come from anywhere, and once it does, nothing will ever be the same. The night it truly awoke, the air shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent at first. It was a subtle assertion of control, a quiet declaration that the rules she had counted on no longer applied. The monster inside him stretched, testing the boundaries of flesh and mind. Every hesitation she had, every plea, every attempt to reason, it only sharpened its focus. She watched as a familiar face twisted, not with anger, but with an intelligence that calculated pain and pleasure like a chessboard, measuring exactly how far it could go. And the terrifying thing, she realized, in a heartbeat of sickened clarity, that she had been complicit. Complicit by believing love could save him. Complicit by ignoring the small, precise warnings. Monsters do not forgive. Monsters do not stumble. They are born from neglect, from hidden agendas, from the darkest corners of human experience where control is absolute and morality is optional. And now, that monster was awake, and she was standing in its path. She had tried to anchor him, to tether him to what she knew as humanity, but the chains she offered were too weak. He moved through the room like a shadow that obeyed no light, tracing paths that no human could predict. And as she realized the depth of what she was facing, a cold, intimate horror settled over her. This was no longer about saving him. This was about survival. This was about understanding that some awakenings cannot be stopped, some darkness cannot be bargained with, and some monsters, once fully conscious, cannot be contained. And the cruelest twist, she had already fallen too deep. Because when a monster wakes, it does not wait for mercy. It hunts. And the one who loved him most would be the first to understand the cost. What she didn't realize was that he hadn't become this in isolation. Darkness like his never appears out of nowhere. Somewhere, deep in the machinery of his upbringing, in the shadows of institutions and ideologies, in the secretive corridors where power whispers and control is taught, the seeds were planted. Every rule he learned, every suppression of instinct, every lesson about obedience and manipulation, it all fed something older, something patient, something designed to rise when the time was right. There are forces in the world that prefer monsters over men who think freely, forces that cultivate them, nurture them, and release them like storm clouds over the unsuspecting. And she, naive, devoted, trusting, was standing in the middle of a tempest she could neither see nor understand. She began to perceive the patterns, the way people were conditioned, the hidden systems that reward cruelty in subtle ways, the psychological levers that could twist morality into compliance, into complicity. He had been sculpted, shaped by every hidden hand that society refused to name. And now, unleashed, he moved like a weapon finely tuned to every human weakness, every invisible crack in her armor, every misstep she had made by trusting him. And you, listening to this, must ask yourself, how much of the world around you is designed to shape people into monsters without you even noticing? How many hands have guided the men you admire, or fear, without your consent? Because when these hidden mechanisms converge inside a single mind, what emerges is not a man. It is a predator. And when that predator awakens, it will not pause for your logic, your tears, or your love. The only option left is to see clearly, to understand the forces at work, and to face the truth that most will never dare confront. The real monsters are not always the ones we fear. Sometimes, they are the ones we are taught to trust. The moment she truly understood the scope of his mind was when the manipulation became invisible. It wasn't in grand gestures or overt threats. It was in the small, precise adjustments to reality, the subtle rewiring of perception, the way he could make anyone question their own memory, their own judgment. He didn't just awaken a monster. He became one with the very systems that kept humanity obedient. Every glance, every word, every pause was engineered to create doubt, fear, and compliance. She began to see it, the way he drew people in, twisted their desires against them, and then left them gasping in the aftermath of his control. And she realized a horrifying truth. He was not only a product of dark design, he was an instrument of it. Somewhere, hidden deep in the structures of power and secrecy, there were manuals, rituals, and patterns designed to teach men like him exactly how to awaken and dominate. And she, in her hope, had underestimated him. She had assumed morality, love, and reason could hold him back. But monsters do not answer to morals. They answer to survival, to instinct, to the quiet code written in shadows that humans rarely see. And the deeper she looked, the more she realized that the world itself was a partner in his awakening. The silent complicity, the suppression of truth, the invisible strings attached to every human interaction, all feeding into the growth of a mind that could annihilate without leaving a mark. Now, she was trapped in a game she hadn't even known existed. And you, watching this, must ask yourself, how many of your interactions, your institutions, your trust, are being quietly manipulated by forces you cannot name? Because the monster that wakes in one man is often the reflection of systems that society refuses to confront. And when she reached that understanding, the nightmare wasn't just him. It was everything that allowed him to become this monster. And the realization that no one was coming to save her. Why now? The change was undeniable. The monster no longer lingered behind his eyes. It had fully surfaced, consuming the man she thought she knew. The subtle whispers had become commands, invisible strings pulling reality into his design. Friends, neighbors, colleagues, they all became pieces on a board he controlled without effort. And she realized, with a chill that froze her blood, that the world itself seemed to conspire with him. Not consciously, perhaps, but through the hidden systems, the unspoken rules, the quiet permissions that society grants to those who wield power without conscience. Every misstep she made, every attempt to confront him, fed the machine he had become. And as she watched, powerless, she understood a fundamental truth. Monsters are not merely born, they are cultivated, and their awakening is orchestrated by invisible hands far older and wiser than any individual. She began to notice the ways he mirrored ancient patterns, the same archetypes of dominance, control, and psychological warfare that have persisted in secret for centuries. It wasn't just cruelty, it was mastery, and it was terrifying. And yet, in this dark revelation, there was a lesson most would never see. To recognize such a force, you must train yourself to perceive the invisible, to read the spaces between words, to sense the patterns that others ignore. She had failed at this for too long, and every failure exacted a cost. And you, listening now, must confront a question that will not leave you. How many monsters walk beside you, hidden behind ordinary eyes, nurtured by centuries of hidden knowledge, waiting for the moment to awaken? Because once they rise, you do not simply survive by running. You survive by understanding the architecture of their power, and by seeing the systems that created them for what they truly are. She began to fight, not with force, but with observation. She had learned the first rule too late. You cannot overpower a monster like this. You can only understand it, map it, and anticipate the architecture of its mind. Every detail mattered, the pause before a word, the way shadows bent in his presence, the invisible levers he pulled without anyone noticing. And as she studied him, a terrifying clarity emerged. He was not acting alone. There were layers of influence, hidden systems, silent enablers, each one shaping the man she once loved into something inhuman. Families, schools, governments, networks of power, threads interwoven into a tapestry designed to produce exactly this. And the most chilling truth, she had lived her entire life inside similar structures, blind to their manipulation, blind to the forces that could awaken monsters around her, or within her. She realized that to survive, she had to ascend into forbidden knowledge herself, to see what others refused to name, to trace the hidden lines of control that society deliberately conceals. And as she did, the monster inside him began to sense it. He paused, measured, tested, as though aware that someone had glimpsed the machinery that gave him dominion. Fear flickered, not in him, but in her. Awareness. The weight of truth is heavier than any physical threat. She had glimpsed the invisible hands that shaped life, morality, and power, and understood, in the marrow of her bones, that confronting such forces changes you irrevocably. You do not step back into ignorance after seeing the machinery of control, the systems of suppression, the architectures of human darkness. And now, she knew that her struggle was not just for survival, it was to understand, to awaken, to see the monster fully in the hidden world that created him. Even if the cost was the last shreds of innocence she possessed, the more she observed, the more she realized that the true danger was not brute force, it was subtle domination. The monster inside him didn't rely on fists or rage. It relied on control, on bending perception, on rewriting reality one small, invisible adjustment at a time. She noticed it in the way he spoke, how he framed choices so subtly that she thought she had free will when she was already trapped. She noticed it in the expressions of those around him, hesitant, cautious, unconsciously aligning with his unspoken demands. And the horrifying truth settled in. He had learned to operate inside systems, to exploit them, to let society do the work of empowering his darkness. There is a lesson here few ever recognize. Control is invisible. It's a whisper in a crowd, a hesitation in a partner, a glance that shifts the room. The monster inside him had mastered it, and she began to see patterns that stretched far beyond their lives, ancient patterns, replicated through generations, hidden in rituals, laws, and the unspoken hierarchy of power. The more she understood, the smaller she felt, but also sharper, more alert. She realized that awareness was both armor and weapon. And yet, with every revelation came a new wave of terror. Knowing the extent of his manipulation meant she could never trust the world around her, could never assume safety. Everything ordinary, everything familiar, was now tinged with the potential for hidden threat. And the most disturbing question surfaced. How many of us live surrounded by monsters we cannot see, cultivated by systems we cannot question, awakened by circumstances we do not even recognize? She had glimpsed it, and now it was alive in the man she once loved. And the only way to survive such a confrontation was to embrace truth's most fear, to descend into forbidden understanding, and to prepare for the moment when love is not enough. Why now? Her world had begun to fracture. Every familiar corner, every place she thought was safe, had become a battlefield. The monster inside him didn't just move through the physical space. He moved through her mind, threading doubt, fear, and despair into every thought. Sleep became a luxury, certainty a memory. Every interaction, every glance, every conversation was a test she could not fail. She began to notice how he could twist events so precisely that she questioned her own memory, her own instincts, her very sense of reality. And the cruelest truth of all revealed itself. Monsters like him thrive on our attempts to understand them, feeding off compassion, love, and hope. He had been awakened not just by circumstance, but by the cracks in her perception, by the spaces where human instinct falters. And she, desperate to save what she loved, became the instrument of her own unraveling. It was a slow, invisible erosion, one calculated step at a time. She saw how easily human systems, laws, social norms, the very rules meant to protect, could be bent, ignored, or weaponized by a mind like his. And every realization came with a price, a growing awareness that the world she trusted was complicit in creating monsters, and that survival demanded a level of clarity most would never accept. She had stepped beyond the line of ordinary comprehension and now faced a cruel paradox. The more she knew, the more dangerous her life became. And you, listening to this, must understand that awareness is not comfort. Knowledge is not safety. When darkness rises in a man like this, the price is your innocence, your certainty, and your ability to believe the world is as it seems. The only option left is to see clearly, to anticipate, and to act with the cold precision that monsters respect, but that humans rarely learn. The first time he struck, not physically, but with the force of his mind, she understood the full magnitude of what she faced. It was in the silence of the room, in the way he shifted the air, the weight of his gaze bending her thoughts against her will. No one had taught her this was possible, that control could feel like gravity, that fear could be injected without a sound, without a touch. And yet here it was, undeniable, impossible to ignore. He had fully integrated the monster within, and it no longer needed permission to dominate. Every lie she had once believed about love, about morality, about the limits of human cruelty, shattered in the shadow of his awakening. And the systems behind him, the unseen architecture of power and corruption, were no longer abstract. They were real, operational, and aligned with his ascent. She realized that his rise was not an accident. It was inevitable, guided by invisible hands, nurtured by suppressed truths, by patterns of obedience and silence that stretch back centuries. And the most terrifying revelation hit her. The world had been complicit. Every manipulation, every hidden agenda, every unspoken rule that taught men like him to rise while others fell, she had been living inside it her whole life. Now, as he tested her limits, probing her fears, bending reality, she faced a singular choice: succumb to the darkness he wielded, or step further into the forbidden knowledge that might, just might, give her a chance to survive. But knowledge comes at a cost. It demands a transformation, a shedding of everything naive, everything ordinary, everything that made life feel safe. And in that moment, she began to understand a truth few ever confront. Monsters do not simply destroy, they illuminate. They reveal the systems, the lies, the hidden hands that shape reality, and they demand that you either adapt, resist, or perish. She had no more illusions left. The battle had begun, and it would not be fought in the daylight of morality. It would be fought in the shadows, where the rules are rewritten by those brave, or foolish, enough to see them. She began to watch the world bend around him. Friends, colleagues, even strangers, each interaction became a reflection of his invisible influence. People didn't just obey, they adapted instinctively, drawn into patterns he engineered without speaking. She realized the truth that most refuse to face. Control is not always visible. It is subtle, systemic, woven into the very fabric of human interaction. And he had mastered it. Every nuance, every hesitation, every trust placed in him was a weapon he wielded with terrifying precision. But the revelation cut deeper. It wasn't just him. It was the system that allowed him to thrive, institutions that reward obedience and cunning, societies that teach compliance while punishing awareness, silent structures that cultivate monsters and release them into the world. Her mind raced with forbidden knowledge, piecing together centuries of hidden agendas, psychological levers, and corrupted hierarchies. And as she traced the lines, she saw the terrifying patterns. Men like him had always existed, nurtured by the unseen hands of power, their darkness amplified by a world that preferred ignorance. Every instinct screamed at her: flee, resist, survive. But she also knew that understanding these patterns was her only chance. The monster inside him thrived on fear, yet knowledge, raw, unfiltered, forbidden knowledge, was the only weapon that could give her leverage, even if slight. And as she stared into the abyss of his mind, she felt the weight of history, of control systems that stretch back centuries, shaping humanity in silence, cultivating darkness with patience. She understood that confronting him meant confronting the very forces that had made him, that had made the world complicit, that had taught monsters to rise while ordinary men and women remained blind. And in that moment, she realized something even more dangerous. Once you see these truths, you can never unsee them. Your life, your perception, your very identity is forever altered. There is no going back. She began to fight, not with fists, but with understanding. She had glimpsed the architecture of his mind, the systems that shaped him, the invisible forces that nurtured the monster inside him. Knowledge became her weapon, observation her shield. Every glance, every pause, every hesitation became data. She mapped his patterns, traced the subtle levers he used to bend reality around him, and began predicting his moves before they unfolded. But the monster was adaptive. Every insight she gained, every strategy she employed, he counted in silence, reshaping the rules without a single overt gesture. It was a war fought in shadows, in whispers, in the invisible spaces where control takes root. And the cost was immediate: her sleep, her certainty, her trust in everything familiar. The world she had known was no longer real. It had become a battlefield, a system designed to test her awareness, resilience, and courage. And yet, within this nightmare, a crucial truth emerged. To survive monsters, one must embrace what others fear, seeing the hidden agendas, uncovering suppressed truths, acknowledging the patterns of corruption that society hides behind the veneer of order. She began to understand that monsters do not exist in isolation. They are the product of systems, of histories, of invisible hands shaping reality to create chaos and obedience simultaneously. And the hardest lesson, confronting him, meant confronting not only the darkness within him, but the darkness that allowed him to exist. Every hesitation, every misstep, every doubt was a lesson in the cruel mathematics of power and control. And as she stood on the edge of despair and revelation, she realized that the monster inside him was not the only danger. The world itself was complicit, and understanding that complicity was the only path to survival. And now, she was beginning to see clearly. The way shadows bend, the way systems nurture darkness, and the terrifying truth. The monster inside him could rise in anyone who had been shaped and molded by forces they would never name. She tried to reclaim agency, to push back against the invisible force that had overtaken him. Every strategy, every maneuver, was calculated, but the monster inside him anticipated with frightening precision. It was not brute force she faced. It was a mind honed to exploit the tiniest fissures in perception, the faintest cracks in trust, the smallest hesitation in resolve. And the terrifying realization hit her. He was not just a man anymore. He was a system, a network of instincts, training, and invisible power structures converging into a single, relentless intelligence. And she was part of its experiment. Every attempt to assert herself was met with subtle recalibration, a psychological counter that left her doubting even her own instincts. He was patient, methodical, and completely without mercy. And yet, even in the suffocating weight of his presence, she discovered the first glimmers of a truth most never see. Monsters are predictable, if you understand the rules that govern their design. Their logic may be alien, their morality absent, but their patterns, rooted in the systems that shaped them, can be studied, mapped, and anticipated. And so she began, slowly, painfully, to track the currents of his mind, the invisible levers he pulled, the way reality bent to accommodate his will. Every detail mattered, every hesitation became a clue, every pattern a potential escape. But the deeper she descended, the more she realized the stakes. Understanding him did not guarantee survival. The knowledge itself was dangerous. Once seen, once grasped, it changes you. It fractures certainties, awakens fears, and illuminates the dark corners of the world that society has spent centuries concealing. And as she braced herself for the next move, she knew one brutal fact. The monster inside him was fully aware of her awakening. And monsters never forgive those who see too much. That it was here, in the depth of her awareness, that the forbidden truths began to crystallize. The monster inside him was no accident of circumstance. It was a product of ancient patterns, a repetition of corrupt forces that have shaped human history in silence. She saw the echoes of rituals, of hierarchies designed to cultivate dominance, cruelty, and manipulation. It was as if centuries of hidden agendas, of secret knowledge and invisible power structures, had converged inside this one man, and the awakening was inevitable. And yet, she also realized something vital. Knowledge itself is transformative. The moment she glimpsed the hidden currents that guide the rise of monsters, she too began to change. She felt her mind expand, her perception sharpen, her instincts honed for survival. And now, for those listening, there is a symbolic step, an invitation to engage with this transformation. I want you to write in the comments the phrase, "I see the hidden hand," twice. This is not just engagement. This is alignment. This is a declaration that you, too, are stepping into awareness, claiming the recognition of forces most ignore, and preparing your mind to confront truths that could alter everything. The monster inside him sensed it, of course. Awareness of the hidden hand is dangerous for those who cultivate darkness. It alerts them, forces them to adapt, to escalate, to test your readiness. And escalation was exactly what she faced next. Every corner of her world, every human interaction, every expectation was now measured against a mind that had been trained, shaped, and awakened by forces older than memory. And as she stepped forward, armed with knowledge, she understood that survival required more than courage. It demanded comprehension of the architecture behind the chaos, the invisible scaffolding that holds monsters in place until they rise. And if you write the phrase, if you acknowledge the hidden currents, you too will begin the journey from ignorance to understanding. Because once you glimpse the machinery behind human darkness, you cannot return. You can only advance, and only advance with precision, awareness, and an unflinching commitment to truth. Once she acknowledged the hidden currents, the monster inside him shifted. He had sensed the spark of awareness, the subtle recognition that she was no longer just reacting. She was observing, analyzing, preparing. And that awareness, terrifyingly, forced him to escalate. Reality itself began to bend in subtle ways. Words twisted, events delayed, people acted against expectation, as if the world conspired with him to test her resolve. He was no longer just a man. He had become a force, a living architecture of manipulation, trained to exploit the faintest hesitation, the smallest flaw. And she felt it, the creeping dread of intelligence that moves faster than instinct, of perception that anticipates before thought. Every decision she made was counted, every attempt to assert control met with invisible pressure. And yet, this confrontation revealed a brutal truth. The only way to survive such a mind is to see beyond its surface, to trace the hidden levers, to understand the patterns of dominance and corruption that created it. She realized that he had been molded by centuries of silence, by invisible systems of power, by histories of control that repeat in cycles until someone finally sees them. And now, she was seeing. And seeing was dangerous. Awareness made her a target because monsters do not forgive insight. They escalate. They adapt. They test the boundaries of your mind and body to ensure you will not challenge them again. Every interaction became a battle of perception. Every glance, every word, every hesitation was now a duel in the theater of invisible control. And she understood, with a cold clarity, that survival demanded more than courage. It demanded mastery of forbidden knowledge, a comprehension of psychological architecture most humans ignore, a willingness to step into darkness and navigate it without losing herself. And he, the monster who had awakened, was learning from her as well, adjusting, calculating, preparing his next move. The war had become invisible, relentless, and utterly personal, and she knew there was no turning back. She began to notice the cracks. They were almost imperceptible at first, a hesitation in his gaze, a slight overreach in a word, a pattern repeated too rigidly. The monster inside him, perfected over years and nourished by invisible forces, was formidable, but not flawless. Every intelligence has a flaw, every system a weakness, and every predator leaves traces of its architecture if you know where to look. She studied him with relentless focus, tracing invisible levers, cataloging patterns, predicting impulses. And as she did, something shifted. She realized that her mind, sharpened by fear and forbidden knowledge, had become a weapon. She was no longer merely a victim. Observation itself was an attack, understanding a shield. But the danger intensified. Awareness alone provokes monsters. Insight forces adaptation. He sensed the shift, and the subtle manipulations grew more cunning, more precise. He tested her reality, pushed boundaries, and pulled the people around her into his control like pieces on an invisible chessboard. Yet each test revealed another fragment of his method, another weakness she could exploit. And she understood something critical. Surviving a monster of this kind is not about overpowering them. It's about bending their system against itself, exploiting the cracks in the architecture that birthed them, anticipating the invisible forces that even they rely upon. And every revelation came with a cost. She could no longer trust instinct alone. She could no longer assume normality. Her life had become a study in perception, in manipulation, in power. And yet, paradoxically, this immersion in forbidden truths, this descent into darkness, was what made her strong enough to survive. She began to see that monsters rise because the world allows them to. But monsters can fall if their own systems betray them, if their hidden architecture is exposed and understood. And she was beginning to expose it, step by step, pattern by pattern, leveraging every insight for survival, for reclamation of agency, for the ultimate confrontation with the force that had consumed the man she once loved. He noticed, subtly at first, a narrowed gaze, a pause that lingered too long, the faintest shift in tone. But she noticed too, the monster inside him was no longer moving blindly. It was adapting, evolving, responding to the strategies she had painstakingly developed. Every subtle observation, every trace of understanding she brought to the table became a stimulus, a challenge, and a test. And he rose to it. Reality itself seemed to bend under his influence. Conversations twisted into traps, social interactions became experiments, and the people around her, innocent, unaware, acted like extensions of his will. She realized then, with a chilling clarity, that she was no longer operating in a human field of battle. She was inside a machine of dominance, precision, and centuries of invisible instruction. And yet, she had begun to manipulate the edges of that system, exploiting the smallest deviations, the tiniest errors, the almost imperceptible cracks in his control. It was a war of awareness, an invisible duel where perception and cognition became the weapons of survival. But each success, each gained insight, triggered escalation. The monster adapted, sharpening his strategies, recalibrating his manipulations, pushing her to the brink of mental and emotional collapse. Every day, every moment, became a high-stakes test of her capacity to remain unbroken. And in this cruel calculus, she discovered the most critical lesson. Monsters do not exist in isolation. They are shaped, nurtured, and reinforced by hidden currents of power, by invisible systems that reward obedience and cunning. To confront one is to confront not only the creature but the entire network of forces that gave it life. And she understood, with a cold, steady clarity, that she had no choice but to immerse herself further into the forbidden truths, to trace the architecture of domination, to anticipate every shadow and whisper, and to prepare for the ultimate reckoning. Every thought, every instinct, every observation was now survival, and failure was not an option. The first cracks appeared not in brute strength, but in imperfection. A flicker of hesitation, a momentary repetition of behavior too precise to be unconscious. It was almost imperceptible, but she saw it. The monster inside him, honed by invisible hands, shaped by systems older than memory, had a flaw. And for the first time, she sensed possibility. Every second of awareness became a weapon, every observation, a blueprint of leverage. Yet this possibility came with danger. The more she probed, the more he adapted, the more his control became sinisterly anticipatory. Reality warped around her. Allies shifted in subtle ways. Events bent unexpectedly, and the lines between trust and manipulation blurred. She understood fully that survival was no longer about confronting him directly. It was about navigating the architecture of his power, exploiting cracks without revealing her strategy, learning to move invisibly within the systems that had nurtured his rise. And the deeper she descended, the more she understood the nature of monsters themselves. They are not born solely of cruelty. They are products of the hidden, disciplined cultivation of power. Every family, every institution, every unspoken societal rule can be a hammer shaping their mind, bending morality, honing instinct. And she, now immersed in forbidden truths, was beginning to see the network behind him, the invisible scaffolding that supported his dominion, the silent forces that allowed him to rise, and the centuries of hidden knowledge that had prepared him for this moment. Awareness was not enough. She had to act with precision, with understanding, with calculated patience. She could feel the monster sensing her intent, testing boundaries, probing for weakness. Every heartbeat, every glance, every thought was a battlefield. And in this war, she realized something profound. The key to survival was not to overpower the darkness, but to infiltrate its logic, to exploit its patterns, to bend its own systems against it, without ever allowing the monster to know she had seen its vulnerabilities. The first step had been taken. The cracks were there, and the descent into mastery and survival was accelerating. For the first time, she felt it. Control, not of him, but of the battlefield itself. She was no longer merely reacting. She was directing, anticipating, exploiting the tiniest inconsistencies in his perfected system. Every subtle hesitation, every repeated pattern, every micro-expression became a thread she could pull. And with each thread, she began to weave a counter-narrative inside the space he had dominated. But the monster was adaptive. He shifted, recalibrated, tested the boundaries of her awareness, and attempted to bend reality itself to his favor. Yet she had learned to read the invisible levers, to understand the architecture that created him, and to move with calculated precision. Her awareness was now a weapon, every observation, a strike in a war fought in shadows. And as she pushed further, she began to sense the larger machinery, the hidden systems of control, the centuries of human patterns designed to cultivate dominance, the invisible hands that had shaped not only him, but the world that allowed him to rise. With this understanding, she realized a terrifying truth. Monsters are products of structures, and structures are most vulnerable when their patterns are revealed. Every move she made now had dual purpose, to survive, and to expose the scaffolding of power that allowed the monster to awaken. And the cost was immediate. She could never trust the ordinary, the familiar, the comfortable again. Awareness demanded vigilance. Comprehension demanded sacrifice. Yet paradoxically, in this descent into forbidden knowledge, she became sharper, more perceptive, more alive than ever. And the monster, sensing the shift, escalated. But every escalation revealed another vulnerability, another crack in the seemingly flawless system. She understood then that survival was not about strength. It was about insight, timing, and unflinching courage. And in this invisible war, every glance, every word, every breath became a battlefield, and she was no longer merely a participant. She was becoming a master of the hidden, a strategist in the shadows, navigating the very architecture of human darkness that had birthed the monster she now faced. The danger escalated. Now, the monster inside him was not just testing her. It was threatening everything she valued. People she trusted, spaces she considered safe, even her own perception of reality were leveraged against her. Every subtle action, every relationship, every expectation became a tool in his hands. He had learned to weaponize not only fear, but care, attachment, and instinct. And she realized a cruel truth. The closer you are to love, the more exposed you are to monsters who understand the architecture of human emotion. Yet she was no longer naive. She had descended too far into forbidden truths to falter now. Every move had to be precise, calculated, informed by patterns she had painstakingly traced. The monster sensed her awareness, and his attacks became more sophisticated, more preemptive. Reality itself seemed to bend to his will, and ordinary people acted like extensions of his influence, unaware of the strings he pulled. And she understood fully that survival required more than reaction. It required anticipation, insight, and mastery of the hidden systems that shaped him. Each moment of understanding became a shield, each realization a weapon, each observation a lever to pry open his control. And yet the emotional toll was immense. The isolation, the fear, the constant calculation. She had to navigate the world as both student and warrior, understanding the centuries of hidden power that produced men like him while simultaneously defending her own mind and life. The monster had become a force, but she had become an intelligence capable of countering that force. And in this war of shadows, every move, every thought, every breath counted. The stakes were no longer just survival, they were mastery, insight, and the willingness to see the world as it truly is, a network of hidden currents, silent systems, and monsters waiting for the moment to awaken, with only those who perceive the architecture of control able to stand against them. The breakthrough came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shift in the current beneath a storm-tossed ocean. She had been watching him for months, tracing his movements, his words, his subtle manipulations, learning the rhythm of the monster inside him. And then she noticed a pattern he had overlooked, something so small it would escape any ordinary observer, but not her. A hesitation, a repeated phrase, a micro-expression when he believed no one was watching. It was a crack in the system, a vulnerability born from the arrogance of perfection. Monsters, she realized, are trained to assume control over others, but rarely train themselves to anticipate insight, to guard against the perception of those who see beyond the veil. And in that moment, she understood that survival was no longer just a matter of defense. It was a matter of strategy, of learning to manipulate the invisible architecture that he had relied upon to dominate. Each step she took from that point forward was deliberate, measured, designed to test his reactions without revealing her intentions. She began setting traps not of force, but of observation, creating circumstances where his patterns betrayed themselves, exposing cracks she could exploit. And the psychological toll was immense. She could feel the monster probing her, sensing her adaptation, escalating his own strategies, twisting reality to test her comprehension and willpower. Every conversation became a jewel of invisible influence. Every gesture, every word, every glance had to be calculated with precision, because any misstep could cost her life, or the lives of those she still sought to protect. Yet, paradoxically, this pressure refined her understanding, sharpened her perception, and revealed deeper layers of forbidden truths. She saw how the systems that shaped him, social structures, invisible hierarchies, hidden power networks, were fallible. She realized that every monster, no matter how perfected, relies on a framework of forces, human behaviors, and predictable patterns that can be turned against them. And in her first subtle victories, she felt the taste of agency returning, a dangerous thrill tempered by the awareness that each success invited escalation. The monster adapted, probing more aggressively, testing every boundary, forcing her to constantly refine her strategy. But with each small triumph, she gained insight into the architecture of domination itself, uncovering truths that would prepare her for the ultimate confrontation. And she understood, more clearly than ever, that monsters are not invincible. They are systems, and all systems can fail if you understand their flaws. The question now was whether she had the courage, the patience, and the precision to exploit them fully before the monster realized her mastery and retaliated with the full force of his awakened power. He began to sense it. At first, she thought she was imagining it. A fleeting glance, a pause in speech, a slight shift in posture. But the truth was undeniable. The monster inside him knew she was no longer blind. He recognized the subtle patterns of her observation, the way she had begun to predict his moves, the deliberate calculations behind her every glance, every hesitation. And with that recognition came escalation. The invisible battlefield had shifted. Where once she could move in the shadows, testing and probing, now she was being tested in turn. Her own thoughts and perceptions subjected to the meticulous, almost surgical scrutiny of a mind honed for domination. Reality itself became fluid. Allies acted in unpredictable ways, circumstances twisted unexpectedly, and the ordinary world seemed to conspire against her, guided by the subtle force of his influence. She understood that he was no longer merely a man, but a living network of power, manipulation, and historical cunning, a predator born of systems and nurtured by centuries of unseen forces. And yet, even within this storm, she detected more cracks, moments where his adaptation faltered, where the perfection of the monster's design left him vulnerable. Every miscalculation, every overreach, became an opening. She began to exploit them with calculated patience, understanding that subtle victories now carried immense weight. But each small gain came with risk. He was aware, anticipating, pushing harder, forcing her to refine her strategy with brutal precision. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep was fractured, reality felt unstable, and every interaction carried the potential for betrayal, manipulation, or exposure. And yet, this was where she began to understand a deeper, forbidden truth. Monsters, no matter how perfected, rely on systems that are inherently flawed, and insight, patience, and knowledge are the keys to exploiting them. She realized that the monster's power was not absolute. It was a function of control, perception, and the complicity of the structures that produced him. If she could understand the architecture fully, anticipate the escalation, and move within the cracks, she could survive. But survival demanded more than courage. It demanded mastery of forbidden knowledge, insight into centuries of human corruption, and an unwavering ability to remain undetected while dismantling a predator far more intelligent and adaptive than any ordinary human could endure. And in that realization, the stakes crystallized. This was not just a battle of survival. It was a war of perception, of strategy, of mind versus mind, where every observation could tip the balance between life and annihilation. The first major victory came without fanfare, almost silently, but it shifted everything. She had been studying him, tracing the patterns, exploiting the tiniest fissures in the architecture of his control, and finally, she acted. Not with force, not with confrontation, but with precision. A carefully placed word, a subtle misdirection, a situation engineered so that his instincts, honed to dominate, betrayed him. And it worked. The monster inside him, perfect and adaptive though he was, faltered. A micro-expression flashed across his face, a pause that was too long, a hesitation that revealed vulnerability. For the first time, she realized that the architecture he relied on, his invisible levers, the networks he manipulated, the systems that had nurtured him, could be undermined from within. And yet, the victory was double-edged. Awareness of the breach, even a microsecond of recognition, provoked escalation. He began to counter, recalibrating faster than she had anticipated, testing boundaries with more intensity, bending reality itself to reinforce his dominance. And she understood fully that survival was no longer about one move or one insight. It was a continuous dance, a relentless war of perception and adaptation, where every small success invited a new counterattack. Her mind became a battlefield, a lab for observation, analysis, and calculated action, where instinct alone could not guide her. She had to anticipate the anticipations, calculate the counters, and operate several steps ahead while maintaining the appearance of ordinary thought. And in this, the forbidden truths revealed themselves more sharply. Monsters are the product of systems, but systems can be broken, and even the most perfect predator leaves traces for those willing to see. The cost of seeing, however, was immense. Every interaction drained her emotionally, tested her resilience, and forced her to navigate reality as a minefield where misjudgment meant devastation. Yet with each small tactical success, she felt the first stirrings of power returning. Knowledge, observation, and strategic insight became her weapons. And as he sensed her growing mastery, the stakes intensified. Every response, every countermeasure he deployed was sharper, more precise, and more dangerous. The battle had become one of chess at the highest order, a duel of intelligence, perception, and patience. And in that duel, she began to understand the ultimate truth. Monsters are formidable, but not invincible, and survival, mastery, and transformation lie in the ability to see the invisible, exploit the cracks, and endure the relentless escalation of a mind that never forgives. Insight. The psychological cost of this engagement was becoming unbearable. Every day, every interaction, every fleeting moment demanded precision, patience, and vigilance. Sleep was fractured. Even rest carried the weight of calculation. Every glance she cast, every word she spoke, was filtered through the lens of survival. The monster inside him was no longer merely reactive. He had become anticipatory, aware that she had discovered the architecture of his control, and now he sought to dismantle her certainty, one subtle strike at a time. It was relentless. Every person she trusted, every ordinary space she had once relied upon, now carried the potential for manipulation. Allies shifted unpredictably, circumstances twisted, reality seemed to conspire against her. And yet, in the midst of this, she discovered an uncomfortable truth. Fear sharpens perception, and awareness is the precursor to mastery. The terror he imposed was a mirror, reflecting not only his darkness but the hidden truths of the world that had nurtured him. She began to see the larger currents at play, the invisible forces, the centuries of psychological systems, the social hierarchies and suppressed truths that allowed monsters to rise unchecked. And this awareness, while horrifying, became a weapon. She could predict, anticipate, and manipulate within the very system that had created him. But the cost was evident in every fiber of her being. Her emotions were constantly tested. Love, loyalty, hope, they all became tools he could twist, levers he could exploit. She had to compartmentalize, to operate with surgical precision, separating instinct from calculation, humanity from strategy. Every victory came at a personal expense, exhaustion, doubt, and the creeping erosion of ordinary life. Yet each micro-victory in her struggle revealed a vital truth. Monsters, no matter how perfected, are bound by the patterns and systems that birthed them. And those who can see those systems, who can trace their architecture and exploit the cracks, gain a dangerous kind of power, one that could tip the balance. She realized that the final confrontation would not be a battle of strength, but of intelligence, foresight, and endurance. And in this awareness, she found clarity. To survive, she could not simply react. She had to anticipate, calculate, and act with the precision of a mind that had descended into forbidden knowledge, navigating the invisible forces of domination that had created the monster she faced. And the monster, sensing her growing command over these systems, escalated, forcing her to endure an ever-tightening psychological siege. Every thought, every decision, every moment of awareness became a battleground, and the cost of failure was unthinkable. She had reached a point where survival was no longer enough. Knowledge had become her weapon, observation a shield, and now she needed action, a subtle, calculated engagement that could turn the monster's own systems against him. Months of tracing patterns, cataloging every imperfection, and anticipating every reaction had brought her to this precipice. And she realized, with stark clarity, that monsters, even those nurtured by centuries of invisible power and human complacency, are vulnerable when their architecture is understood and exploited. Every maneuver she planned was psychological, a delicate orchestration of anticipation and misdirection. She had to remain invisible within the very currents he manipulated, undetectable even as she subtly influenced them. And the monster sensed it. His awareness of her shift in perception provoked escalation. Subtle manipulations became sharper, every interaction a test, every word a trap. Yet she did not falter. She had seen the scaffolding behind his power, the hidden levers, the centuries of human systems that allowed him to awaken, and she began to use that knowledge to her advantage. People he had influenced unconsciously became vectors for subtle disruption. Situations that he assumed were under his control now carried the potential for exposure. And in exploiting these tiny fractures, she discovered a horrifying, intoxicating realization. Monsters are not infinite, they are systems, and systems, no matter how perfected, are vulnerable to those who understand their architecture. But the psychological cost was immense. Every observation drained her emotionally. Every calculation demanded unflinching focus, and every move carried the weight of potential annihilation. She was dancing on the edge of sanity, operating in the shadows of human darkness where mistakes were fatal. And yet, for the first time in months, she felt a surge of power. Insight, when paired with precision, became influence. Awareness became leverage. And the monster, sensing the subtle shifts in his environment, reacted with escalating cunning, testing her limits, bending reality to his will. The invisible war had entered a new phase, a duel of intelligence, strategy, and perception. And she understood, finally, that survival alone was insufficient. To endure, to overcome, she had to master the system itself, turning the architecture of his power into a trap, a cage, a mechanism that could be used against him without ever revealing her intent. Every glance, every word, every carefully calculated step became a thread in the tapestry of this silent, deadly war. A war where knowledge was both weapon and shield, and the stakes were life, death, and the transformation of her own mind into something sharper, stronger, and irrevocably awakened. The moment of escalation was unmistakable. The monster inside him had begun to sense the subtle sabotage, the invisible pressure she was exerting against the very systems that had nurtured him. His movements became sharper, more unpredictable, as though reality itself bent in anticipation of her next calculation. And yet, she had grown into something the monster had not anticipated, a mind trained to observe, to exploit, and to act with precision against forces that others would never perceive. She began to see the edges of his control fray, the smallest inconsistencies in patterns he relied upon. People who had once been extensions of his were slipping, responding in ways he could not fully anticipate. Situations that had seemed unbreakable now offered openings, microfishes she could leverage. But the cost was immense. Every interaction, every second, carried the weight of danger. A single misstep, a single exposure of awareness, could provoke retaliation unlike anything she had yet faced. The invisible war became total. Every glance, every word, every decision was a battleground of anticipation, manipulation, and counter-manipulation. And through it all, she understood a deeper truth. Monsters are most dangerous when they are unaware of their own limitations. He had been shaped to dominate, to control, to awaken from the forces that had cultivated him for centuries. Yet even he, for all his cunning, had cracks. And insight, patience, and the relentless study of patterns could turn those cracks into leverage. She moved invisibly within the currents he had created, using subtlety and precision to create imbalance, while maintaining the facade of ordinary existence. Each micro-victory revealed another layer of hidden truth. The world itself, structured around obedience, suppression, and silent manipulation, had enabled him. To dismantle him, or even survive, she had to navigate not only his mind, but the architecture of the systems that fed him. The monster reacted, sensing the invisible pressure, escalating to compensate. Every interaction became a duel of perception, a clash of invisible forces, and yet she persisted, turning observation into strategy, strategy into influence, influence into leverage. And through this, the realization crystallized. Mastery over the systems that shape monsters is not just survival, it is transformation. Every step she takes now alters not only the dynamics of power but the very essence of who she is becoming. And in this escalation, the battle edges closer to a tipping point where one miscalculation, one revelation, will change everything. For both predator and prey, forever the tension had reached its peak. Every moment she had spent observing, calculating, and exploiting the cracks in his system had led to this, an invisible tipping point where the monster's control was no longer absolute. She could feel it in the smallest cues, a flicker in his gaze, a misalignment in his carefully constructed patterns, a hesitation in his manipulation that had never existed before. He was aware, yet uncertain, forced to adapt faster than even he had anticipated. And she, armed with months of forbidden knowledge, invisible observation, and relentless analysis, began to turn the tide. Every subtle action she had orchestrated, the choice of words, the positioning of people, the seemingly ordinary events she had nudged, now coalesced into leverage against him. She moved as though invisible, a phantom within the architecture of his control, striking not with force, but with precision that destabilized his perception and undermined his dominion. But the stakes could not have been higher. One error, one lapse in awareness, and the full force of his wrath would descend upon her, a storm honed by centuries of hidden systems and human complicity. Yet she pressed on, understanding the critical truth. Monsters are products of architecture, and all architecture has weaknesses. The brilliance of her strategy lay in exploiting the unseen, in bending his own carefully cultivated systems against him without revealing intent. Each micro-victory fed her confidence, but also provoked escalation. He adapted, probing, testing, twisting the environment to expose her calculations, trying to regain absolute control. And in this invisible war, every interaction became a battlefield, every moment a duel of perception, intelligence, and anticipation. She felt the gravity of it. This was not merely survival. It was transformation. Her mind, trained in forbidden patterns, honed by fear and observation, was now operating at a level where she could anticipate not just his moves, but the hidden systems that produced him, the centuries of manipulation that had enabled his rise. And in that understanding, she saw the final truth. Victory would not come from strength or emotion. It would come from knowledge, strategy, and the relentless application of insight to exploit the cracks he had failed to hide. The monster had been awakened for centuries, nurtured by history, but she, too, had been transformed. And now, in the quietest moments before confrontation, the invisible scales began to tip, a subtle shift in the balance of power that neither predator nor prey could ignore. As the stage prepared for the culmination of this deadly, psychological, and invisible war, the moment had arrived. Every calculation, every observation, every subtle maneuver of the past months converged into a single, invisible strike. She had mapped his patterns, traced the architecture of his dominance, and patiently nudged the system toward instability. And now, the monster inside him, perfect in appearance but flawed in subtlety, revealed the vulnerability she had been cultivating. It was in the slightest hesitation, a flicker of indecision, a moment where centuries of hidden forces that had nurtured him could no longer hold their flawless rhythm. She acted, not with brute force, not with emotion, but with surgical precision. Every word, every gesture, every calculated movement pressed against the crack she had discovered, turning his own mechanisms against him. And he faltered. The imperceptible shift of power was terrifying in its clarity. The predator, long thought invincible, was now exposed, struggling to adapt to the very pressures she had engineered. Reality itself seemed to waver. Allies he had unknowingly manipulated began acting outside of his control, circumstances twisted, and the invisible scaffolding of power that had sustained him trembled. And yet, even in this decisive moment, danger remained absolute. One miscalculation, one premature revelation, could unleash catastrophic retaliation. Her mind raced, balancing anticipation and patience, exploiting every trace of weakness while avoiding any exposure that would trigger his counterattack. And as the monster strained to maintain dominance, she understood the profound truth that had guided her from the beginning. Monsters are systems, and no system, no matter how perfected, can withstand sustained insight and calculated pressure from one who sees its architecture fully. Each second of awareness became a weapon, each observation a lever, and each action a move in the invisible war she had orchestrated. The psychological weight was immense. Every victory carried the dual burden of potential failure and the knowledge that the world itself, shaped by centuries of hidden agendas, had allowed such monsters to rise. Yet she pressed on, relentless and precise, and with each step, the imbalance grew. The monster struggled, adapted, and yet the momentum was irrevocably shifting. And in that subtle, almost imperceptible tipping, she saw the culmination of her descent into forbidden knowledge. The predator was vulnerable, the systems that empowered him were exposed, and the invisible scales of power were finally tilting in her favor. The war of perception, of strategy, and of invisible forces had reached its apex, and the outcome now hung on the razor edge of intelligence, insight, and relentless resolve. The culmination was nothing like she had imagined. It was quieter, sharper, and far more profound than any confrontation of brute force. In the invisible war she had waged for months, every insight, every calculated move, every subtle manipulation converged in a single moment of clarity. The monster inside him, once a seemingly invincible force, now teetered on the edge of exposure. His systems, honed by centuries of hidden agendas and nurtured by complicit structures, were unraveling under the precision of his strategy. And yet, the victory was not triumphant in the way the world celebrates. It was psychological, silent, a reclamation of perception and agency. She had learned to navigate fear, to observe without attachment, to exploit patterns without cruelty. And in doing so, she had transformed herself. The monster, sensing the collapse of his control, lashed out in instinct, twisting the environment, testing boundaries, manipulating allies. But every move now revealed cracks she had meticulously engineered. And in those cracks, she saw the truth that had guided her descent. Monsters are not omnipotent. They are systems, patterns of dominance sustained by ignorance, complicity, and fear. To confront them is to confront the architecture of human darkness itself, and mastery requires insight, patience, and the willingness to embrace forbidden knowledge. She realized that the war had never been about him alone. It had been about understanding the hidden forces that shape reality, the invisible hands that cultivate darkness, and the subtle levers that give power to those who understand the system. And as the last threads of control slipped from his grasp, she felt something extraordinary, a transformation within herself. Fear had sharpened into awareness, observation into strategy, survival into mastery. She understood, finally, that the monsters in the world are only as formidable as the ignorance of those who encounter them. And she had seen, and she had endured, and she had acted. The invisible battle had ended, not with annihilation, but with the reclamation of her own mind and agency, forever altered by the truths she had uncovered. The world, once opaque, now revealed its hidden architecture, its silent systems of power and corruption. And for those who witnessed, even in story, the descent and emergence, there remained a final warning. Awareness is dangerous, forbidden, and transformative. Once you see the machinery behind human darkness, you cannot return to ignorance. You can only move forward, sharper, stronger, and irreversibly awakened. The monster had been contained, the system exposed, but the lesson lingered. The real battle is not with one man, but with the unseen forces that shape monsters, and those who dare to confront them will never be the same again.